There is a small bedroom on the upper floor of Hardwick Old Hall, in the ruined north wing above the great chamber, where a single window looks east across the Derbyshire hills toward the Chesterfield Road. The window is narrow. The plaster on the walls is cracked and dark. The floorboards, where they survive, are worn in one particular strip between the bed frame and the desk, as if a woman walked back and forth across that 6 feet of oak for a very long time, thinking. English Heritage relabeled this room in 2018. Before then, it was described simply as an upper chamber. The new label says, "The bedchamber of Lady Arbella Stuart, granddaughter of Bess of Hardwick and second cousin to Queen Elizabeth VII, who was kept in this room, and others like it, for the better part of 20 years, and who died in the Tower of London in 1615 after refusing food for 123 days. That is the room where the story starts. Not the story of the house, which is famous, the story of the woman inside it, which was, until 1994, almost entirely forgotten. Her name was Arbella Stuart. She was born on the 10th of November 1575 at Chatsworth, 12 miles south of here. Her father was Charles Stuart, Earl of Lennox, the younger brother of Henry Darnley, the Scottish lord who married Mary Queen of Scots, and who was murdered in a garden in Edinburgh in 1567. Her mother was Elizabeth Cavendish, one of the daughters of Bess of Hardwick, then the richest woman in England after the Queen. On her father's side, Arbella was the niece of Mary Queen of Scots. On her mother's side, she was the granddaughter of a woman who had built 4 great houses out of nothing and buried 4 husbands to pay for them. By the accident of both bloodlines, Arbella was second cousin to Queen Elizabeth I through Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's elder sister, and by the arithmetic of the Tudor succession. When Elizabeth died childless, Arbella stood second in the queue for the throne of England, behind only her Scottish cousin, James VI. Some at court, and quite a few on the continent, thought she stood first. She was 7 years old when her mother died. Her father had died 6 years before that, at Sheen, of a wasting disease that killed him within a fortnight and left his infant daughter, then 6 months old, the heiress to the Lennox earldom in Scotland, though the Scottish Parliament refused to recognise her claim and the title lapsed. Her mother, Elizabeth Cavendish, who was 30 when Charles Stuart died and who had married him without her mother's permission in 1574, spent the next 5 years fighting the Scots for the earldom, fighting Elizabeth for her daughter's English pension, and living, by the end, in rooms at Sheen and then at Hackney that Bess paid for. She died on the 21st of January 1582, aged 36, of what her mother's household accounts describe as a lingering fever, and which was probably tuberculosis. She was buried at Sheen. Arbella did not attend the funeral. She was already at Chatsworth. She was orphaned in 1582 into the household of her grandmother. For the next 20 years, Bess of Hardwick raised Arbella as an heir, not as a granddaughter, as an heir. The distinction matters because it explains everything that happens later in this script, and it explains the shape of the small bedroom in the old hall. Bess did not let Arbella out. She did not let her attend court, though invitations came. She did not let her marry, though offers came from Parma and from Poland and from Savoy. She controlled the tutors. She controlled the letters. She controlled the clothing. And by the 1590s, when Arbella was in her late teens, she was dressing her granddaughter in gowns 20 years out of fashion, so that ambassadors who visited Hardwick reported the girl looked as if she had been embalmed in the reign of Mary Tudor. Bess did this on purpose. She was preserving her. She was saving her, in the 16th century sense of the word, meaning storing, keeping in reserve, for the moment the old queen died and the crown of England was on the table. You have to understand what Bess of Hardwick was in that decade to understand why the small bedroom existed at all. Bess was born Elizabeth Hardwick in 1527 in a modest manor 2 miles from where the great house now stands, the 4th daughter of a Derbyshire squire who left almost nothing when he died. By 1582, she was the widow of 2 husbands, and the estranged wife of a third, the Earl of Shrewsbury, from whom she had recently obtained a separation on terms that gave her Chatsworth outright, and about £7,000 a year in rents, which in modern money is a fortune of the sort that funds not houses but small kingdoms. She had also, and this is the key fact, been for 15 years the jailer of Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth III's captive cousin, whom Shrewsbury had kept in a succession of Derbyshire and Staffordshire houses on the Queen's orders. Mary had lived in Bess's houses. Mary had embroidered with Bess in her sitting room. Mary had also, according to the letter of accusation Mary herself wrote to Elizabeth in 1584, gossiped with Bess about the Queen's private life in language that Elizabeth, when she read a copy of it, is said to have burnt in her fingers. Bess had, in other words, sat for a decade and a half within touching distance of a woman who was, and remained until 1587, one of the strongest candidates for the throne of England. She had watched a claimant close up. She knew what a claimant looked like, and when her own granddaughter arrived at Chatsworth in 1582, orphaned and small, with the same blood in her veins, Bess made a private decision, of a kind she had made twice before in her life, about houses and about husbands, that this child would be prepared. Prepared meant kept clean. Prepared meant kept indoors. Prepared meant kept away from anything that could taint her Protestant credentials, complicate her legal status, or embarrass her in front of a future Privy Council. Prepared meant kept, in effect, in a small bedroom. That moment came, and it did not come, and it came again, and each time Arbella waited in the bedroom. This is a video about that woman, about what it does to a person to be raised for a throne she never sat on, about the two men she tried to marry, both called Seymour, both grandsons of the wrong queen, about the escape in June 1611, when she cut her hair, dressed in a black hat and a man's cloak and a pair of French breeches, and rode from Barnet to the Thames at Blackwall, and got into a French coaster, and almost made it to Calais, about the recapture, about the Tower, about the hunger strike that lasted 4 months, and about the small square of stone in Westminster Abbey in the south aisle of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, where in September 1615 they lifted the lid of Mary Queen of Scots' tomb and laid Arbella's body on top of her aunt's coffin, because no one at court was willing to pay for a grave of her own. If you have ever walked through Hardwick Hall, the great new house that Bess built on the ridge in the 1590s, you have walked past her. Her portrait hangs in the long gallery, one of hundreds. Most visitors do not stop. The National Trust Guide, until quite recently, mentioned her in a single line. Hardwick was Bess's house. Arbella was the granddaughter who married someone unsuitable and died sad in the Tower. That is not the story. That is the summary a Victorian steward invented because the real story was too dangerous to tell for 300 years. The real story begins with a marriage negotiation in 1592. Arbella was 17. Bess, through her son-in-law Gilbert Talbot, and through channels in Antwerp, opened a correspondence with the Duke of Parma about the possibility of Arbella marrying Ranuccio Farnese, the Duke's eldest son. Ranuccio was Catholic. He was also, through the Farnese line, a great-great-grandson of Pope Paul III. The marriage would have made Arbella the future Duchess of Parma. It would also, in the calculation of half the chancelleries of Europe, have made her the Catholic candidate to succeed Elizabeth I, backed by Spanish gold and a fleet from Antwerp. Elizabeth found out in the winter of 1592. She was furious. She summoned Bess to court, refused to see her, sent instructions through Robert Cecil, and made it very clear that if the Farnese marriage went one step further, Bess would go to the Tower, and Arbella would be taken from her. Bess, who was 75 years old, and who had survived 4 husbands and 1 imprisonment already, backed down. Arbella went back to the bedroom. The Farnese collapse marked a shift in her granddaughter that the letters, when Steen finally sorted and printed them 4 centuries later, make plain. Before 1592, Arbella writes to her tutors and to Bess in a formal, decorous, slightly wooden hand, the writing of a well-taught girl practicing the phrases of the schoolroom. After 1592, the hand changes. The letters become longer. The syntax becomes more elaborate. She begins to write in 3 languages within a single paragraph, switching to Italian for a joke, to Latin for a citation, to French for a sigh. She begins to sign her name with a flourish that copies, quite deliberately, the signature of Elizabeth I. She begins, when she writes to her uncle, Gilbert Talbot at Sheffield, to sign herself Arbella S., without any title, as if she is testing what an unmodified name might feel like. She has understood, at 17, that the marriage she was almost sold into was the last real chance to leave the house, and that from now on the doors will not open, and the mind, which is the only thing Bess has not been able to lock, is where she is going to live. For the next 10 years she read, wrote, walked in the walled garden between the new hall and the old, ate at her grandmother's table, and did nothing. She learnt Latin and Greek from a Cambridge man named Robert Starkey. She learnt Italian and Spanish from an Italian tutor whose name is lost. She wrote poetry in 3 languages. She wrote letters to relatives she was not allowed to see. She wrote a diary, most of which Bess burned. She was, by every account we have from ambassadors who visited, one of the most educated women in England, and one of the most miserable. She was 27 years old, and she had never spent a night outside her grandmother's house. In the autumn of 1602, she cracked. What follows is the moment the whole story turns on, and it is worth telling slowly because the letters survive. In August 1602, Arbella wrote a note in her own hand, sealed it, and passed it to a servant named John Doddridge, who was a groom of the household. The note was addressed to the Earl of Hertford at Tottenham. The message asked, in careful language dressed up as a poem, whether Hertford would consent to the marriage of his grandson, Edward Seymour, to Arbella Stuart. Edward Seymour was the 17-year-old grandson of Catherine Grey, the sister of the 9-day Queen Jane Grey. Catherine Grey had, in the eyes of many, a claim to the English throne. Edward Seymour had inherited that claim. So did Arbella. A marriage between them would combine 2 of the strongest Protestant claims to the succession into one household, one bloodline, and quite possibly one throne. The note was, on its face, madly indiscreet. It named the boy, it named the marriage, it named the woman proposing it. It was written in a hand Cecil's clerks could identify at a glance, and it was sent through a servant Arbella had never used before, whose loyalty she could not have tested. Modern historians, working from Steen's edition and from the John Doddridge deposition that survives among the Cecil papers at Hatfield, tend to agree that Arbella meant to be caught. She did not want the boy specifically. She wanted the marriage to be made public so that the Queen would either bless it and let her out of Hardwick, or forbid it and take her out of Hardwick into some other confinement that was at least in the south, at least at court, at least away from the small room. She was, in other words, using the succession the way a swimmer uses the current, not to reach a chosen shore, but to reach any shore, not this one. Hertford, who was old and terrified, and remembered what had happened to Catherine Grey's own marriage 40 years before, read the note, panicked, and sent it straight to Robert Cecil. Cecil sent it straight to the Queen. Elizabeth was dying. She was 69. She had lost most of her teeth. She had refused for 2 years to name a successor, and she was, according to her ladies, sleeping upright in a chair because she was afraid that if she lay down, she would not get up again. When Cecil brought her Arbella's letter, she read it in silence. Then she said, according to a report Cecil later wrote to James in Scotland, only this: send Brunker. Sir Henry Brunker was a middle-aged servant of the Privy Council, a man used to interrogating recusants and traitors, chosen for this errand because he was tough and discreet. He rode north from London in the 3rd week of December of 1602. He arrived at Hardwick on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, and he demanded to see Arbella alone. Bess refused. Brunker insisted. Bess produced Arbella in the withdrawing room, in the presence of her chaplain, and Brunker began to ask questions. What was in the letter to Hertford? Who wrote it? Whose idea was the marriage? Had Arbella been in correspondence with the King of Scotland? Had she been in correspondence with the Pope? Arbella, aged 27, answered in 3 languages. contradicted herself, wept, laughed, refused to eat, and at one point, according to Brounker's dispatch to Cecil, began to speak of herself in the third person as though she were already the Queen of England. Brounker went away. He returned in January. He questioned her again. He questioned Bess. He questioned the servants. He read every letter in the house. And in the end, he reported to Cecile that Arbella was, in his judgment, not a traitor, but a woman driven half out of her mind by 20 years of confinement. His recommendation was that she be confined more strictly. Brounker's dispatches, which are preserved in the Cecil papers at Hatfield in volume 135, run to about 40 pages of close writing across 3 visits between December 1602 and March 1603. They are one of the strangest surviving documents of the late Elizabethan state. They record a middle-aged Privy Council officer trying, in the middle of a Derbyshire winter, in a stone withdrawing room lit by a single fire, to work out whether a 27-year-old woman who is fluent in 6 languages and who quotes Cicero at him is a traitor, a fantasist, or simply, as Brounker eventually concludes, in a state of grief so total that grief has become a species of madness. He notes the fine details. He notes that she cannot keep still. He notes that she laughs in the middle of a sentence about her own possible execution at the memory of a childhood joke. He notes that when he mentions Bess by name, she goes silent for a quarter of an hour. He notes that she has a small book, which she keeps in her sleeve and which she will not let him see, and which, when he finally insists, turns out to be a French translation of the Book of Job. His recommendation to Cecil, which Cecil endorsed and the Queen approved within a week, was in 3 parts. First, no marriage. Second, no correspondence beyond the household without Bess's countersignature. Third, no visitors of any degree without a written permission from Cecil himself. It was, in effect, house arrest under the constitutional cover of family care. There was no formal charge. There was no trial. There was no term. There did not need to be. The Queen was dying. The succession was uncertain. The great families of the Midlands could be relied upon to keep their own quiet, and Bess, who had built her fortune on that reliability, would keep hers. Bess agreed. From January 1603 onward, Arbella was locked in her bedroom, not the bedroom in the new hall, which was too fine, but the small bedroom in the old hall, the one still standing today, where the window is narrow and the door is heavy, and the walk to the desk is 6 feet across worn oak. She was permitted one servant, Elizabeth Digby, her grandmother's chambermaid. She was not permitted ink. She wrote anyway, on the fly leaves of her books, in the margins of her Bible, in the blank pages of an almanac, and Elizabeth Digby, at some personal risk, smuggled the notes out through the kitchen door and down to the Chesterfield post, where they went to Arbella's uncle Gilbert Talbot, and from him to friends in London, and from them, eventually, into the great archive of the Talbot papers that now sits in Lambeth Palace Library and in the Bodleian at Oxford. It is from those letters, edited by the American scholar Sarah Jane Steen at Oxford University Press in 1994, that we know what Arbella was thinking in the small bedroom. One line from letter 32, written to Robert Cecil in September 1602, 3 months before Brounker arrived. I would rather be a wretched captive prisoner in the Tower than a princess in this vile world. One line from letter 41, written to Gilbert Talbot in February 1603, 1 month after the door was locked. My grandmother has kept me from all society, from all letters, from all knowledge of my kin and my degree in the world. She was 27 years old. She had been in the room for 6 weeks. She had another 12 years left to live, and 8 of them would be spent behind heavier doors. Between January and March 1603, the small bedroom became, in effect, a diplomatic annex of the Privy Council. Messengers rode up from London every 10 days. Cecil, who was also in correspondence with James in Edinburgh, was using Arbella as a piece on a board he did not yet know he was going to win. If James came south peacefully, Arbella would be quietly released as a favoured cousin. If James refused, or died on the road, or was rejected by the English lords, Arbella would be produced as the Protestant alternative. She was, in Cecil's private notes, referred to only as the Derbyshire piece. She did not know she was being called that. She thought she was being kept because she had written a letter to a boy she had never met. Both things were true at once. On the 24th of March, 1603, Elizabeth the died at Richmond Palace at 3 in the morning. Cecil's messengers rode north to Edinburgh. James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The succession that Bess had spent 20 years preparing Arbella for had happened, and Arbella had lost. At first, it did not look like loss. James, who was 36 and who had never met his English cousin, sent a warm message north. He instructed that Arbella be released from Hardwick and brought to court. She arrived at Whitehall in the summer of 1603, aged 27, in the outdated clothing her grandmother had dressed her in for a decade, and James's queen, Anne of Denmark, took one look at her, laughed, and had her fitted with a new wardrobe. For 2 years, Arbella was a favourite. She rode in the royal barge. She danced in masques by Ben Jonson. She was given a pension of £800 a year and a house at Sheen. Her portrait was painted 3 times. She wrote to Bess, still at Hardwick, letters that survive in the Cavendish archive, describing gowns and jewels and the taste of pineapple. It did not last. By 1608, James had begun to notice that half of Europe still considered Arbella a plausible alternative queen. He cut her pension. He forbade her to marry. He made it clear, through Cecil, that any marriage negotiation involving her would be treated as treason. Bess died at Hardwick on the 13th of February 1608, aged 81, having not seen her granddaughter in 5 years. Arbella did not attend the funeral. She was not permitted to leave court. The years 1608 and 1609, between Bess's death and William Seymour's appearance, were the loneliest of her adult life. Sheen was a large empty house on the river. Her pension had been cut from £800 to £400. Her creditors were writing to Cecil for payment of debts she could no longer meet. Her cousin, the Queen of Denmark, was no longer amused by her. Her letters to William Cavendish, her uncle at Hardwick, describe days spent walking in the orchard, evenings spent reading Seneca, and one particular week in the autumn of 1609 when, according to a note in the Cavendish archive, she did not speak to a single person for 6 days because there was no one in the house except a cook and a groom, and she did not wish to trouble them. She was 33. She had never lived alone. She had never chosen a friend. She had never, in her whole life, made a single significant decision that was not first cleared by her grandmother or her king. In the summer of 1610, aged 34, she made her decision. She had met, at court, a young man named William Seymour. He was 22. He was the grandson of the same Earl of Hertford whose reply to the 1602 letter had ended her life at Hardwick. He was, in other words, the younger brother of the Edward Seymour she had once tried to marry. The Seymour claim to the throne had passed to him. The combined Seymour-Stuart claim, if the two of them married, was arguably stronger than James's own. This was known to James. It was known to Cecil. It was known to William. It was known to Arbella. She married him anyway. The ceremony took place at 4 in the morning on the 22nd of June 1610 in a private chamber at Greenwich Palace. 2 servants witnessed it. William went back to his lodging. Arbella went back to hers. They kept it secret for 16 days. On the 8th of July, 1610, the marriage was discovered. James was informed at Theobald's. He was, according to Cecil's dispatch, more frightened than angry. He ordered William Seymour to the Tower of London and Arbella to house arrest, first at Lambeth, in the house of the Bishop of Durham, then, when she attempted to send messages to William, at a house in Barnet, 10 miles north of London, under the guard of a man named Sir James Croft. She waited in Barnet from July 1610 until June 1611, 11 months. During that time she wrote, according to Steen's edition, at least 40 letters to William in the Tower, most of which the guards intercepted and copied for Cecil. She also planned, with an efficiency that surprised everyone afterward, an escape. On the afternoon of the 3rd of June 1611, Arbella dressed herself in a pair of long French hose, a man's doublet of russet cloth, a peruke of long dark hair, a black hat, a black cloak, and a rapier. She walked out of the Barnet house on the arm of a servant named Markham, mounted a horse waiting in the lane, and rode 14 miles across country to Blackwall on the Thames, where a French coaster was waiting. She boarded the coaster. It sailed at 9 in the evening on the ebb tide. It reached the Nore, off the mouth of the Thames, by midnight. It made open sea by dawn. William Seymour, on the same afternoon, walked out of the Tower of London in the guise of a carter delivering wood, walked down Tower Wharf, got into a rowing boat, and made his way east along the river toward Lee, where a separate French boat was supposed to be waiting. It was not. He waited on the beach. He missed the tide. He hired a collier the following morning that took him to Ostend. Arbella, on her French coaster, was becalmed off Calais on the 4th of June 1611. At about 2 in the afternoon, a naval pinnace under the command of Admiral Griffin, sent out from the Downs by Cecil's men the previous evening, came alongside her ship. Griffin boarded. He found Arbella in her man's cloak, still hoping, waiting on the deck for William. He took her aboard the pinnace. He turned back for the English coast. By the evening of the 5th of June, she was in the Tower of London. She would never leave it again. The escape was the closest thing to a happy hour her adult life contained. The letters, printed by Stein from the Talbot papers, show that in the weeks before the 3rd of June, she had recovered a kind of practical cheerfulness that had not been in her writing since 1592. She had a plan. She had accomplices. She had a boat. She had, for the first time in her life, chosen the man she loved and was going to meet him. The Markham, who rode with her from Barnet, was a servant of her Uncle Gilbert's, who had known her since she was a girl at Chatsworth. The French coaster at Blackwall was hired for £40 by a friend of William's called Rodney. The wig she wore was made in Aldgate by a woman who thought she was fitting an actor. She rode the 14 miles to the river in the afternoon light of a June day, with her hair cut short and her sword at her hip, and according to Markham's later deposition, laughing. She had never in her adult life been on horseback without a groom. She rode well. Griffin's pinnace, when it came alongside her ship the next afternoon off Calais, closed on her because William had failed to keep the tide. If William had reached the coaster on the 4th of June, as they had planned together in 50 smuggled letters, she would have been in Ostend by nightfall. She would probably, given the political map of Europe in 1611, have lived. James would not have gone to war with France to recover a stray cousin. William was already known in Paris. The pair would have lived out a modest exile on Seymour's uncle's pension, and Arbella would have appeared at intervals in the dispatches of ambassadors as a curiosity, and would have written, probably, a book. That is the life she nearly had. The tide took it away. The 4 years that followed are, if anything, the strangest part of the story, and the least well known. She was 35 when she entered the Tower. She was 39 when she died. The lieutenant of the Tower for most of that period was Sir William Ward, a hard man who had also, at various points, been the jailer of Sir Walter Raleigh, the plotters of the Gunpowder Plot, and half a dozen recusant priests. Raleigh, in fact, was still in the Tower when Arbella arrived. He was in the Bloody Tower, writing his History of the World. She was in the Queen's House, above the gate. They were 50 yards apart. There is no record that they ever spoke, but Ward's letter book, now in the British Library, as Harleian MS 7002, records that Raleigh sent Arbella, at some point in 1612, a small bottle of a cordial he had distilled himself, which he called his balsam. Ward intercepted the bottle. He did not deliver it. He wrote in his book, "The Lady Arbella has been given no comfort this day." Her aunt, Mary Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury, the daughter of Bess, who had helped organize the 1610 marriage, was arrested in the winter of 1611, interrogated by Cecil, refused to answer any questions, and was herself imprisoned in the Tower for the next 4 years. She was in the Beauchamp Tower, 40 yards from Arbella, and again there is no record that they were ever permitted to meet. William Seymour, in exile in Ostend and then in Paris, wrote to Arbella twice a year. None of his letters reached her. In the autumn of 1614, 3 years into her imprisonment, Arbella stopped eating. It was not at first a hunger strike. It was, according to the Tower physician Dr. Palmer's notes, a refusal of solid food that Arbella described to her chambermaid, Elizabeth Bradshaw, as a sickness of the stomach. She took broth, she took wine, she took bread soaked in milk. By the spring of 1615, she was taking nothing but wine and water. By the summer, she was taking nothing but water. By August, she was refusing water. The Venetian ambassador, Niccolo Molin, writing to the Doge on the 4th of October, 1610, near the beginning of her Tower years, had already reported, "The Lady Arbella has spent all this year in an extremity of grief. She refuses food. She refuses light. She refuses to speak the king's name. That was 1610. By 1615, it was the same, only more so, and the body was giving out. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 25th of September 1615, Sir William Ward, or rather his successor, Sir Gervas Elwes, wrote in the Tower letter book, "The Lady Arbella died this afternoon at 3 of the clock. She had refused sustenance for 123 days. She was 39 years old. The physical record of the last 4 years is thin, and thin on purpose. Ward, and after him Elwes, kept the Tower letter book under lock. Very few visitors were allowed. The Venetian ambassador was refused an audience twice. The French ambassador was refused 3 times. Prince Henry, before his own death in 1612, is said by one Jesuit source to have asked his father whether Arbella might be released, and was told no. The King's Queen, Anne of Denmark, who had once dressed Arbella in the new gowns of 1603, sent a message through her chamber in 1613, asking that Arbella be permitted better food. The message was received, and according to Ward's private note, ignored. Cecil, who had been the architect of the whole confinement, died in May 1612 of stomach cancer at Marlborough on his way home from Bath, aged 48, and the confinement continued without him because it had by then become policy rather than person. Arbella wrote, in those Tower years, about 40 letters, of which 16 survive. Most are to William, and most were intercepted before they left the walls. One, written in the winter of 1613, is to James himself, and it is the strangest thing she ever put on paper. It is 14 lines long. It asks nothing. It complains of nothing. It merely describes, in a formal Italian sonnet form, the light through the window of her chamber at dawn. Stein prints it as letter 132. It is, on its face, unpolitical. It is also, if you read it carefully, a claim of full sanity written to prove, in a form the king liked, that the woman writing it was capable of governing herself, and therefore, by implication, capable of being trusted with her own liberty. James is not known to have read it. If he read it, he did not answer. James I, informed the same evening at Royston, gave orders for a private burial. Westminster Abbey received the body at night. There was no funeral procession. There was no monument. The Dean of the Abbey, John Williams, opened the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots, which James had built for his mother in the south aisle of the Henry VII chapel 8 years earlier, and Arbella's coffin was placed directly on top of her aunt's, because the vault was small and no separate space had been prepared for her. There was no inscription. For the next 387 years, no visitor to Westminster Abbey knew that Arbella Stuart was there. The upheaval was not only hers. Look at the wider country in those 4 Tower years. James was fighting Parliament. Cecil was dying, and did die, in May 1612. Prince Henry, the king's heir, died in November of the same year of typhoid, aged 18, throwing the succession open again and reopening for anyone who wanted to look. The question of Arbella. Sir Walter Raleigh, in The Bloody Tower, was writing that history of the world in which he argued that God brings down the mighty. The Overbury poisoning scandal broke in 1615. The same summer, Arbella was starving to death, and it destroyed the reputation of the king's favourite Robert Carr. The Jacobean court was tearing itself apart, and Arbella, who might have been queen of it, was above the gate refusing water. The war that mattered was not on a battlefield. It was in that room. Around Arbella, in the 20 years at Hardwick and the 4 years in the Tower, there were 3 servants whose lives were bound to hers, whose names survive in the records, and whom the visitor to Hardwick or to Westminster Abbey ought to know. The first was Robert Starkey. He came to Hardwick in 1590 when Arbella was 15, and stayed until 1602, when the Bronca interrogation broke the household. He was a Cambridge man, a Kingsman, moderate in religion, unmarried, in his early 30s when he arrived. He taught Arbella Latin and Greek, Hebrew for reading the Old Testament, Italian for reading Petrarch, French for reading Rabelais, Spanish for reading Cervantes in manuscript, and mathematics for the sake of it. 12 years he lived in the household. He is named in Bess's account, books at £3 a quarter, rising to £5 by 1600. He was dismissed without a reference in January 1603 after Brounker's interrogation, on the grounds that he had, or might have, encouraged Arbella's Seymour correspondence by giving her too much to read. He returned to Cambridgeshire. He never taught again. He died in Ely in 1621, 6 years after Arbella, in a small parish where the burial register describes him simply as Robert Starkey, sometime tutor to a great lady. The second was Elizabeth Digby. She was Bess's chambermaid from 1580, 3 years before Arbella arrived at Hardwick, and she stayed in the household until Bess's death in 1608. From about 1582, she was assigned specifically to the child. She dressed her, fed her, put her to bed, and from January 1603, when the door was locked, carried her letters. She appears in the Hardwick household manuscripts, now in the Bodleian at the reference DD 1-65, in a series of entries between 1601 and 1608 that record payments to her of 20 shillings a quarter, which was more than the other chambermaids received. Bess must have known she was carrying the letters. She paid her more, and she did not stop her. That silence from a woman who controlled everything is one of the more interesting details in the archive. Elizabeth Digby left Hardwick when Bess died. She married a Chesterfield brewer named Bradshaw in 1609. She lived, as far as we can tell, until at least 1630. The third was Elizabeth Bradshaw, who was very likely, though not certainly, a niece or a daughter-in-law of the Elizabeth Digby who married the Chesterfield brewer. She appears in the Tower Warden's records for the years 1611 to 1615 as Bradshaw, chambermaid to the Lady Arbella, wages £1 the month. She was the woman who, in the autumn of 1614, first noticed that Arbella was refusing solid food. She was the woman who, in September 1615, sat by the bed. She was the woman who wrote, or dictated, the short note that went out of the Tower to Mary Talbot in the Beauchamp Tower on the afternoon of the 25th of September, saying only, "She is gone." Elizabeth Bradshaw was paid off 2 weeks later and vanishes from the record. 3 women, a tutor, a Derbyshire chambermaid, a Tower chambermaid. Between them, they knew Arbella better than anyone else alive, and none of them wrote a memoir, and all of them died in obscurity, and it is only because of the Bodleian Ledger and the Tower Warden's book and the parish register at Ely that we know their names at all. There is a modern history to this story too, and it matters because for 3 centuries Arbella was almost invisible between 1615, when she died, and 1994, when Sarah Jane Steen at Oxford University Press published the Letters of Lady Arbella Stuart. There was no proper edition of her writing. There were antiquarian mentions. There was a Victorian biography by Elizabeth Cooper in 1866, which used many of the letters but treated Arbella as a tragic, romantic heroine, all veils and swoons. There was a chapter in David Durant's biography of Bess of Hardwick in 1977, sympathetic but brief. That was it. For 380 years, the second in line to the throne of England lived in a footnote. Steen's edition changed that. It printed 150 of Arbella's own letters from the Talbot papers, the Cecil papers, the Cavendish archive, the Bodleian Hardwick manuscripts, and the British Library, with full scholarly apparatus, and it made clear, for the first time in modern print, that Arbella was not a swooning heroine, but a formidably intelligent woman who had been broken by 2 decades of confinement and had left a written record of the breaking that was fully the equal, as a piece of English prose, of anything by Donne or Bacon in the same years. Sarah Gristwood's biography, Arbella, England's Lost Queen, published by Bantam in 2003, took Steen's letters and built the first full modern life around them. It was a bestseller. It went into 6 impressions. It was translated into French and Italian. It put Arbella, for the first time in her afterlife, on the shelves of British bookshops next to Elizabeth the Free and Mary Queen of Scots, where the arithmetic of the Tudor succession had always said she belonged. In 2002, the Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey, prompted by Gristwood's research and by requests from readers of Steen's edition, opened the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots for a modern conservation survey. They confirmed from the physical evidence and from the 17th century burial register what the archive had always said. Arbella's coffin was there, on top of her aunt's, undisturbed since 1615. They did not remove it. They did not add an inscription then, but the Abbey now identifies her on the label in the Henry VII chapel and in the official guidebook as buried in that tomb. There are, in the wider culture, 3 further signs of the recovery. First, in 2006, the Royal Shakespeare Company staged a new play about Arbella at the Swan Theatre in Stratford, written by the playwright Peter Oswald, which ran for a full summer season and drew a critical notice in The Guardian, describing Arbella as the most misused woman of the English Renaissance. Second, in 2013, a BBC Radio 4 documentary presented by the historian Helen Castor traced her life from Chatsworth to Westminster and drew for the first time on national radio on the Steen letters, read aloud by the actress Juliet Stevenson. Third, and quietly, the Bodleian in 2019 completed a full digital catalogue of the Hardwick manuscript, making the letters and the household accounts freely available online to any researcher with an internet connection, which has produced, in the last 5 years, a small wave of doctoral theses in the United States and in Germany on the political correspondence of women in Jacobean confinement, most of which take Arbella as their central case. She is now, 400 years after her death, the most studied Jacobean woman writer after Emilia Lanya, and the volume of writing about her doubles roughly every 5 years. At Hardwick, the National Trust and English Heritage, who between them look after the new hall and the old hall respectively, have both, in the last 15 years, put Arbella back into the narrative of the site. English Heritage's 2018 rewrite of the old hall labels mentioned at the start of this video is the visible sign of that shift. Hardwick receives about 200,000 visitors a year. Most of them still come for Bess, but a growing minority come because they have read Gristwood or Steen or the Wikipedia article that draws on both, and they walk past the great chimney-piece and up the ruined stairs to look at the small room with the narrow window. And they stand there for a few minutes, and they understand what happened. That is the modern recovery of Arbella Stuart. It has taken 30 years. It is not finished. There is still no full biography of her since Gristwood's in 2003. There is still no dedicated exhibition of her letters at any national museum, though the Bodleian holds them. There is still no monument at Westminster Abbey. There is still no school syllabus in England that includes her, though every schoolchild learns the names of her 3 royal relatives, and Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots, and James VI appear in every textbook of the period, without the second cousin who stood beside them in the family tree and who wrote, from a bedroom in Derbyshire and a room above the Traitor's Gate, some of the sharpest prose any Englishwoman produced in the reigns of both those queens and that king. There is a plaque petition quietly circulating among historians associated with the University of Nottingham and the National Trust to install a small carved inscription on the old hall wall at Hardwick and a matching stone in the south aisle of the Henry VII chapel at Westminster. Both petitions were, at the last check, still gathering signatures. Neither had yet been approved. 400 years and counting. Now go back, at the end, to the room. The bedroom in Hardwick Old Hall is still there. The window is still narrow. The floorboards, in the strip between the bed and the desk, are still worn. Somewhere in the wall, in the dark plaster, are the shadows of the paper Arbella tore from the fly-leaves of her books when Bess would not let her have ink. Somewhere in the mortar are the pinpricks where she tacked up the small paper portrait of her mother that Bess did not know she still had. The desk survives. It is in the Bodleian now, part of the Hardwick manuscript collection, along with the letters and the household account and the burnt scrap of what may have been her diary. English Heritage keep a reproduction in the room. The unmarked grave in Westminster Abbey is still unmarked. If you go to the Henry VII chapel and stand in the south aisle in front of the great white monument that James I put up to his mother in 1607, you are within 8 feet of Arbella. Her body is inside the tomb, above her aunt's coffin. There is no name, there is no date. The Abbey now says, on request, where she is. Very few visitors ask. For 380 years no one knew. For 30 years now, since Steen and Gristwood, we have known. She is still up there. She always will be. In the small bedroom at Hardwick, and in the unmarked tomb at Westminster, and in the 150 letters that survive in the Bodleian and Lambeth and the British Library, and in the small paragraph on the English Heritage label that finally, 4 centuries late, gives her back her name. Arbella Stuart, Lady Arbella, second cousin to Elizabeth, niece to Mary, granddaughter to Bess, wife of William, prisoner of James, tutor of Starkey, mistress of Digby, patient of Bradshaw, and, in one of the crueler footnotes of English history, the woman who came within a June tide and a becalmed sail of being Queen of England. She is still in that bedroom. She always will be.